Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Jackson Crawford. After a long career of teaching subjects like Norse language, myth, and sagas at universities like UCLA, Cal Berkeley, and Colorado, I became a full-time public educator in these subjects as of 2020, using my YouTube videos as well as my Amazon best-selling translations of Norse myths and sagas to reach out to the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people who are interested in these topics, but don't have a university nearby in which to get good information about them. Today, what I want to talk about a little bit is an oft-requested subject, which is cursed and otherwise magical swords which pepper the sagas. And in particular, I'll be looking at probably the most famous example, Tyrfingr. Now the sword Tyrfingr, which appears in the saga of Hervor and Heidrek, Hervarar saga og Heidreks, which is shortly to appear in the next couple months in a new translation by me, together with the saga of Rolf Kraki in Two Sagas of Mythical Heroes, my fourth book of translations from Hackett. Pretty excited about that. This sword's name has often been misinterpreted as Tyr, the god, the one-handed god who has his right hand bitten off by the Wolfenrir finger, right? Like it's the finger of the god. In fact, the word finger in Old Norse is fingr, F-I-N-G-R, but the R at the end of the name Tyrfingr is not part of the root, right? The R is just a grammatical ending. It's not present in the object, right? Tyrfingr sits on the table, but I pick up Tyrfing. For more about that, you can see my lessons about Old Norse. Old Norse actually has endings on nouns that appear and disappear based on the use of the word in a sentence. So the R is not actually part of the root of the name, but also it's not a long Y, it's a short Y, but it's a long Y in the god's name. So two more plausible possibilities for the meaning of the sword's name would be that it's the one from the turf, right? That T-Y-R-F potentially being related to English turf. These are very closely related languages after all. That would make sense because the sword is taken out of the burial mound of the berserker Angantyr by his daughter Hervor. Another possibility that's maybe a little bit more intriguing is that it has something to do with the name of a Gothic tribe recorded in late antiquity as being named the Tyrfingr. Now, how exactly their name would get applied to the sword is not too clear, but it's interesting to note that in alternative accounts of the same characters that are talked about in the saga of Hervor and Heidrek, Tyrfing is actually given as the name of one of Angantyr, the owner of one of the early owners of the sword. It's given as his brother instead of the name of a sword in the saga of Eroad in Old Norse, and in Saxo Grammaticus' history of the Danes, book 5, just to give you a more specific reference there. And of course, Saxo's history of the Danes is written in Latin, but there is a good translation out there by Fisher if you're looking for that. So what can we say about Tyrfingr in the saga of Hervor and Heidrek? There are a few manuscripts of the saga of Hervor and Heidrek that are useful, but they actually differ a fair amount from one another. The text that most translators, including me, use as far as it goes as being the most reliable is the so-called R text, manuscript GKS 2845 quarto. And when we first read about the sword there in chapter 1, we read this, and just for a little flavor, I'll give it to you in Old Norse. Þessi konungur hafði eignatsk sverð það af dvergum Tyrfingr het, og allra var bitrast, og hvert sinn því var brugðið, þó lysti af svo sem af sólargeisla. Aldrei mátti hann svo hafa beran, að eigi urði hann manns bani, og með vormu blóði skyldi hann jafnan slíðra. En ekki var það kvikt, hvorki menni kvikvendi, lifa mætti til annars dags, ef sár fekk af honum, hvort sem var meira eða minna. Aldrei hafði hann brugðist í hogi eða staðar numið, fyrr en hann kom í jörð, och så mader han bar I orstu, mundi sigir få, ev honom var fegit. Which, I don't have my Polish translation on me right this moment, but that says something like, this king, he's talking about a king named Sigurlami, had come into possession of a sword from dwarves, which was called Tyrfing, and it was the sharpest, bitterest bitrast of all. And every time that it was drawn, it shone as if from a ray of the sun, like what is pounded down on me right now. He could never have it bare, i.e. have it drawn from the scabbard, without it becoming a man's death, and it must always be resheathed with warm blood. So you had to kill someone with it before you put it in its sheath. And there was nothing alive, neither men nor animals, who could live to another day if they got a wound from it, the sword, whether it was bigger or smaller. And it had never been drawn in a strike or hit an object before it came into the earth. What it means is it swings so hard that when you cut at someone, it's not just going to like go halfway through him, it's going to go all the way into the earth because it's just that sharp. It cuts through anybody like butter. And the man who carried it in battle would always have victory if he swung Tyrfing. So we have a fantastically capable sword, but also one that has, depending on your perspective, a bug or a feature that it has to kill someone anytime that it's drawn, and it has to be put back into its sheath with warm blood upon it. Right. Now, I mentioned that that's the first that we hear about it in the most reliable manuscript of the Saga of Hervor and Haetheric. Other manuscripts give a little bit more information, probably drawing mostly on traditions that are not so old, but kind of interesting anyway. So, for example, the manuscript Hauksbok, which is sort of famous for having alternative versions of Old Norse text preserved in probably older forms elsewhere. For example, it has a form of the poem Voluspa about the beginning and end of the world with extra stanzas that aren't in the main manuscript of the Poetic Edda, the Codex Regius. It also has a weird abridged form of the Saga of Eric the Red about the discovery of Vinland or North America. Hauksbok has a version of the Saga of Hervor and Haetheric that has a lot of extra material in its first chapter, including some interesting stuff about Tyrfing. So there we read that it's not Sigurlami himself, but rather his son Svavarlami who gets this sword. This sort of thing where it's, it's not the guy, but the guy's son who does X, Y, or Z is really common in the variations of myths and sagas. So this king Svavarlami, while he was out hunting, saw two dwarves by a stone, and he used a magic sword that he already had to enchant the dwarves from going into their stone home. Dwarves are portrayed as living inside of rocks in Norse sagas. He tells the two dwarves that he'll release them from this magic enchantment that he's put upon them if they will make him the best sword that they can. It needs to be golden hilted, able to cut through iron like cloth, it needs to never rust, and it needs to guarantee victory to the man swinging it. So they appoint a particular day and time for him to come back and get this sword back from the dwarves. He comes back on the appointed day. They give him this sword, Tyrfing, and before returning to his rock, one of the dwarves named Dvalin, I think this is one of the names that Tolkien uses as a dwarf name in his stuff. The two dwarves that make this are called Dvalin and Dulin. Dvalin, anyway, curses the sword and says it will cause a man's death each time it is drawn. It will perform 3 evil deeds, or be used to perform 3 evil deeds, and it will cause Svavarlami's own death. And in fact, it does, because Svavarlami will fight a duel against a berserker. During the duel, he will swing the sword. I think it cuts through the berserker's shield and gets stuck in the earth. So the berserker cuts his sword arm off, takes the sword, and kills Svavarlami with it. So the curse is fulfilled. Now, that is not the most famous place in the saga in which the sword Tyrfingr comes up. For that, we have to turn to the undead Angantyr, who is a berserker who ends up inheriting the sword, and his daughter Hervor, who comes and takes it out of his grave mound. And I'll talk about that a little bit right after a quick word from my sponsor. Now, whichever version of the saga that you read, the sword Tyrfingr passes down in the family line of Sigurlami or Svavarlami and reaches a berserker named Angantyr. Not to belabor a pretty long and interesting early part of the saga too much, but Angantyr gets killed on the island of modern Danish Samsø, Old Norse Somsøy. This is an island kind of weirdly associated with magic and strange happenings in Old Norse literature. And he is buried there with his sword. Well, his daughter Hervor is raised far away somewhere by her maternal grandfather and doesn't know her dad was the famous berserker Angantyr. When she finds out, she resolves that she will go find where he's buried on the island Samsø, dig into his grave, and take it from his zombie. And so, disguising herself as a man, she lives as a Viking for quite a while, gets herself a Viking crew, and goes to Samsø, and then she alone breaks into the burial mound of her dad, and there's this whole rock opera of a real archaic Old Norse poem, Eddic style, where she talks to her dad about the sword. He says, no, you can't have it, it's cursed. She keeps hammering on him about it, and eventually he gives it to her. That poem is called in Old Norse Hervor, poem of Hervor. Often in English, it's known as the Waking of Angantyr. 3 years ago, when I was first working on the saga of Hervor and Heidrek, before that translation project got interrupted by the Wanderers Hall of Maul and 100 other things, I actually did a video with an early draft of my translation of that whole poem. I'll put that in a card in the top right if you're watching this on YouTube in 2021. So anyway, Hervor takes the sword from her dead father's grave. She ends up passing it on to her son Heidrekr, another major character in the saga. He passes it on to his son Angantyr, and of course the fact that the sword has to always draw blood before it's sheathed is a major plot point in several of the disasters that befall this family over this short and just really action movie-like saga. Now, I mentioned that my translation of the saga of Hervor and Heidrek will appear in a book called Two Sagas of Mythical Heroes, together with another saga called the Saga of King Rolf Kraki and his Champions, Rolf's Saga Kraka och Kapahans. And King Rolf Kraki in that saga also has a sword with some special properties named Skovnungr. This sword is kind of, it almost seems like kind of an afterthought in the saga of Rolf Kraki. It only kind of crops up by name in very late chapters, but it's talked about like we should already know something about it, so something's kind of missing there. But that whole saga is a weird compilation. It's almost like it's like 5 seasons of a TV show that each had different writers. They're all interesting in their ways, but they are kind of loosely stitched together. And what's interesting though is that sword Skovnungr actually does show up in sagas of Icelanders set in later times, in the early Viking Age centuries in which Iceland was settled. So for example, it shows up in Cormac saga, where it has a special snake that lives inside the sword that has to be treated properly, right? It has to be kind of coaxed and petted for the sword to work properly. It also shows up in the famous Laxdæla saga, or modern Icelandic Laxdæla saga, Saga of the People of Laxdæla, where it belongs to a guy named Thorkel, who doesn't have to, but who carries a stone, which is the only thing that can heal a wound made by this magic sword, Skovnungr. And in fact, when he dies at sea, the sword sort of survives the shipwreck and somehow makes its way to a small island out at sea, which is later named Scotland Island. Now, that saga, the Saga of the People of Laxdæla saga, which I've done a video series about, I'll put that link to that in the card in the top right too, has another interesting sword with some special properties, sort of, called Footbiter, which it doesn't take a whole lot of Old Norse to see means footbiter. Footbiter belongs to a fellow named Geirmundur Gnir, Geirmund, like noisy. He marries a certain Thureither, daughter of Olavr, who's a major protagonist in the saga. And at one point, after they've had a little girl, Geirmundur decides he's going to abandon his wife, Thureither. He gets on a ship, starts to sail out of harbor, but gets stuck. The wind is against him, so he stays in harbor for weeks and weeks and weeks with the wife and child he just tried to abandon right there watching him from the shore. You know, awkward situation. We've all been there. And one night she gets tired of this impasse and actually rows out to his ship in a little boat with their baby, finds him asleep in his cot, takes the sword out of the cot and puts the baby in there. As she rows away, he wakes up, finds the baby, and shouts at her as she's rowing away a curse. And he says, "That lät ek þó melt at detta svärd verði þeim manni at bana I utvari mester skadi at och oskapligast komi við." So I let it be said that this sword will be the death of the man in your family who will be the greatest loss and who will least deserve it. Sure enough, she'll end up giving it to her foster brother Bolli, who will use it to kill her brother Kjartan, who is a real classic saga hero who nobody wanted to die or lose. Now, this notion of the sort of magic sword is certainly well known outside of Norse literature, right? Think about Excalibur, think about lightsabers, which are kind of the same thing, right? It's interesting how swords end up with a certain kind of personality, even when they're not speaking characters, as they can be in Finnish literature, by the way, in the Kalevala. But they end up sort of being imbued with a certain livingness. This might have to do with what prestige objects they are, right? A sword is contra a lot of TV, movies, games, etc. A sword would not have been a common man's weapon. A sword involves a lot of iron, which is difficult to acquire, difficult to produce, difficult to work. So it would be something that would belong to a person of some status and means, and that person would probably not have, you know, lots of swords, but one particular sword that was probably an heirloom, and because of the sword's expensiveness, status, it's being passed down through several generations. It might well have a name and have certain sort of superstitions attached to it, right? It needs, only this rock can heal wounds made by it, or it needs to be coaxed in a certain way, or you need to have warm blood on it before you resheath it. That one would actually be practically pretty difficult, but, superstitions like this could accumulate about a sword over time pretty easily, I think, as opposed to a more common everyday man's weapon like spear. Notice in Norse literature, when weapons in general are talked about, especially in poetry, it is more likely to be the word spear that is used rather than sword, because anyone can relate to a spear. Probably any man has a spear because it's also a hunting implement, right? It's not just a weapon, it's a multivalent tool. So for example, in the famous Hall of Maul 38, where Odin says that a man ought to always have a weapon at his side, what he literally says is spear, even though of course the meaning is more generally a means of self-defense, right? If you are interested in the more practical sides of Norse weapons in combat, right now, when this video is first being posted on, what would that be, Friday, July 30th, we will be having a live crowdcast on my Patreon with William Short of Hurstwick. We'll be talking about his new book, Men of Terror, A Comprehensive Analysis of Viking Combat, and answering patron questions about Viking weapons in combat. So if you're a patron, make sure to get that registration link on the Patreon page and hop on, because if you're seeing this while this video is brand new, you'll still have a chance to get on. After that, I will of course put that Patreon conversation, the Patreon crowdcast conversation on YouTube at a later date, of course, for other people to watch, but they won't have the chance to ask questions. Those crowdcast conversations that I do with interesting experts and also just interesting friends of mine are just part of the little ways that I try to say thank you to my Patreon supporters who have allowed me to make more of a living from teaching than I ever did at teaching at any university. Well, thank you for your time, and for now, from beautiful Colorado, let me wish you all the best.